This video is going to cover the divisions of the nervous system. So we're going to be looking at the central nervous system, and that's the brain and the spinal cord, and the peripheral nervous system, which is everything else. These are the learning objectives, and please take the time to make sure that you are able to achieve these by the end of the lesson. These are the key words that we're going to cover in this video. There are quite a few of them, but luckily we see repeats here, so we can apply knowledge here and add it to different structures. So this is Mike. Mike was a very famous headless chicken, and he lived for 18 months. So great article to have a read at, and hopefully by the end of this lesson you'll be able to determine why this is relevant and how Mike was able to live for so long without a head. Alright, just to get us started, a couple of key words that we use in human anatomy. When we want to talk about the front of something, we refer to that as ventral. Sometimes you'll see that as anterior. In today's lesson, we're going to be using the word ventral. The back of something is referred to as dorsal. We have used the word posterior, but we're going to be focusing on the word dorsal this time. So ventral and dorsal. Okay, so we're going to be looking at terminology relating to nerves. We have touched on this very briefly, so just to give you a quick review. Afferent nerves are what we associate with sensory neurons or sensory nerves. These carry information from the receptors in the sense organs, and they deliver that information to the central nervous system. So afferent nerves are sensory nerves, and they deliver information to the brain and the spinal cord. Conversely to that, we have efferent nerves. Efferent nerves carry information away from the central nervous system. So another way of saying that is that they are outgoing nerves, and we would associate them with motor nerves because they deliver nerve impulses to muscles and glands. Okay, just another little recap. Our nervous system is made up of nerve fibers, and there are afferent and efferent ones, so sensory and motor nerve fibers. The way that our nerves are arranged is quite specific, so we need to remember that a nerve cell has nerve fibers, and those are the axons of the nerve cell. So nerve fibers are the axons, and nerves are bundles of nerve fibers or bundles of axons of nerve cells. Just important to keep these definitions in your head as we go through. So the nerves that we have in the body are arranged like this. So we have 12 cranial nerves, so those are the ones that cover your head and your face. And we have 31 spinal nerves. So these originate from the spinal cord and go in and out of the body. Final word here that we need to learn about is the term ganglia, or if you're talking about one, it's a ganglion. Ganglia are groups of nerve cell bodies, so we're looking at the soma here, and they are outside the brain and the spinal cord. So these collections of nerve cell bodies specifically outside of the central nervous system, so that is to say in the peripheral nervous system, are referred to as ganglia. Here's just an image to help you remember all the terminology that we've come up with so far. So a ganglion is a group of nerve cells outside of the central nervous system. So these swellings that you can see here, these are ganglia. We have nerves, so remember a group of nerve fibers outside the central nervous system. and we have a tract, which is a group of nerve fibers inside the central nervous system. So we call them different things to make sure that we are distinguishing between the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system outside the central nervous system. Okay, so again, we're going to be looking at cranial nerves. So there are 12 pairs of these, and they all arise from the brain. The majority of them are mixed nerves. So what a mixed nerve is a nerve that contains both sensory and motor nerve fibers. So it's like two lanes of traffic going against each other. So you have the sensory nerves taking information towards the central nervous system, and you have the motor nerves taking information away from the central nervous system. The spinal cord, again, we need to be able to label a diagram such as this. This is a classic diagram. Hopefully you are recognizing straight away that the central butterfly-shaped region is gray matter. So that contains mostly nerve cell bodies and some dendrites. And then we have the white matter on the outside, which is mostly axons and nerve fibers. And again, we're just going to revisit those words. So we've got the dorsal root. So this is the root of nerves coming out of the central nervous system, out of the spinal cord. And we have the ventral root. Okay, the dorsal and ventral roots connect together to make a spinal nerve. And you'll notice here on the dorsal side, we have a swelling. So because it's in the dorsal root, we call it the dorsal root ganglion. A few things to note about the dorsal and ventral roots is that the ventral root, excuse me, contains the axons of motor neurons. So we would say that these contain efferent neurons. Okay, the cell bodies of these motor neurons tend to be found in the gray matter in the spinal cord here. And on the dorsal side, this contains sensory neurons. So this is feeding information into the central nervous system. So this is the afferent division. And its cell bodies, unlike the motor neurons, are outside in the dorsal root ganglion. So a good way to help yourself learn what's going on here is to draw a comparison table between afferent and efferent neurons. So you might want to pause the video and sketch out a little table using these notes to help you summarize that information. Okay, so here we're just showing another diagram of the spinal column, and we've got a transverse section of the spinal cord here, and we can see the gray matter, that H or butterfly-shaped mass containing nerve cell bodies. In this region, we get interaction with interneurons. So the motor, sensory, and interneurons will synapse with each other here. This is the dorsal side, so there's the word up here to help me orientate myself. The dorsal side we know contains sensory nerve fibers. So this is the afferent division of the nervous system. So from our nerve, we have our dorsal root ganglion, and that sensory nerve transmits information into the dorsal part of the spinal cord. Underneath, we have the ventral part. So again, spinal cord containing mixed nerve, and the motor neurons travel along this ventral route into the ventral part or the bottom part of the spinal cord. Here I'm just showing you an image containing the dorsal root ganglion just enlarged, so you can see that here. So what we have is the dorsal root ganglion, and like I said to you before, this is a collection of nerve cell bodies, which is why you get this swelling here. It's not just one, it's many of them. And you have sensory neurons, so individual sensory neurons, and the collection of them in that dorsal or upper portion of the spinal root is called a ganglion. So this is what this is looking like here. So this is the dorsal root ganglion. This is our mixed nerve. What you can see is the spinal nerve is coming into the central nervous system. This kind of branches off like a fork in the road. So the top region, we have the cell bodies of the sensory neurons in that ganglion. They are outside of the central nervous system, and those nerves feed into the top portion of the spinal cord. If we go back to our mixed spinal nerve, the bottom fork, if you like, is the ventral root. You'll see that there are no cell bodies here. They are inside the spinal cord. This is just the motor nerves, or the afferent nerve fibers. Okay, here's a little cartoon image for you to perhaps redraw and label yourself, just to summarize what we've been looking at. The skill that you should have is that you should be able to draw this, label each part, and identify what's going on. Okay, just a summary here for the spinal cord. It is a communication network between muscles, glands, and the brain. So we have the efferent division, motor division, taking information out and receiving information. So the spinal cord is an integration center, and we focus on the spinal cord when we discuss protective reflexes, which we'll get to later. Now, because our afferent or sensory nerves are taking information towards the brain, so they're going from the spinal cord up to the brain, so they are described as ascending tracts. Okay, now the word tract is here because we're going into the brain. Coming out of the spinal cord or the brain, we have the descending tract. So these are motor axons, or the efferent division of the nerve pathway. So just to summarize what's going on here, sensory information goes in the ascending tract towards the brain. Descending tract carries efferent or motor axons away from the brain. So now that I've introduced those words, afferent, efferent, dorsal and ventral and ganglion, hopefully you're feeling more comfortable with those. And now we're going to add on just a couple of extra layers to that. We're going to be looking in this slide about the word somatic. So here we have sensory neurons which are taking information towards the CNS from receptors in the skin, possibly muscles and joints. So remember, sensory information is taken towards the brain so that we can integrate and find out what's going on. Okay, so a word that we associate with information traveling in this way is that it is somatic sensory neurons, and these are afferent neurons. Information coming out of the spinal cord, we know that's the motor nerves taking that information away. And when it's sending information to skeletal muscles, so this is voluntary muscles, this is described as somatic motor neurons. And because they're coming out of the central nervous system, they are also efferent. Okay, so just to summarize what's going on here, we have somatic sensory neurons which take information from the skin, our muscles and our joints, telling us what's going on in our environment. So this is on the conscious level. And we have somatic motor neurons which take information to our skeletal muscles, and that's important here because again they are under conscious control. Okay. The other side of that, when we're not talking about conscious control, but we're talking about autonomic control of the nervous system, this is also described as visceral. So again, we have sensory information that comes from our internal organs. So you know when something's causing a pain in your internal organ structure. Let's say you've got a tummy ache, something like that. It's sensory neurons that are visceral that send that information back to the central nervous system. Okay, so you are not in direct conscious control of these afferent and efferent messages. Similarly, we are not talking about skeletal muscles here. We're talking about the muscles that you have no conscious control of. So therefore, this is regarded as autonomic or visceral. So motor nerves that take information away from the central nervous system and to organs such as the heart muscle, involuntary muscles such as smooth muscle in your digestive tract, and even glands such as sweat glands. These are under autonomic control, which means that we are not consciously controlling those things, and that can be further subdivided as sympathetic or parasympathetic. So just linking into what we've talked about before, we know that adrenaline stimulates the sympathetic nervous system, and you're not in control of the amount of adrenaline your body secretes. So if you have a lot of nervous stimulation to your sympathetic nervous system, we would expect the heart rate to go up because the heart muscle is contracting much faster. All right, so now we're going to be looking at a summary of what we've discussed so far. At the top here in our hierarchy, we have the central nervous system, remembering that contains the brain and the spinal cord. And beneath that, we have afferent division of the central nervous system, the nervous system, and this is taking information towards the central nervous system. So afferent neurons can be somatic sensory neurons, and this is conscious control. So these are neurons from the skin that detects our environment and our skeletal muscle in particular. We also have the subconscious control, which we regard as visceral sensory. So what we need to look at here is that both of them detect changes in the environment, internal or external. Somatic sensory is under conscious control. Visceral sensory is under unconscious control or subconscious control, I should say. And this is from internal organ structures. Information from both these divisions of the afferent or sensory nervous system send information to the CNS. On the other side, information that comes out towards effector organs are from neurons classed as efferent. So the efferent division of the nervous system, we know that this must be sensory because it's coming away from the CNS. Again, we have the conscious control division, which is somatic. So this is the somatic motor division, and this carries messages to skeletal muscles. So that's really important here. On the other side of that, we have the autonomic division, and this carries messages to involuntary muscles such as smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, and also glands. And finally, this autonomic division of the nervous system can have two opposing effects. It can speed things up or slow them down. So that can be sympathetic or parasympathetic. Now just remember that it's not always going to be the case that the sympathetic division of the nervous system will have a positive effect and parasympathetic negative. So we'll talk more about that later. Everything inside this red box is in the peripheral nervous system. So we are taking information from these four divisions of our nervous system, and we are on the left-hand side, sensory visceral, we are feeding that information into the central nervous system, and on the right-hand side, we are actively doing things based on that information. Okay. Now we're going to have a little look at the efferent somatic division of the central nervous system. So efferent, we know it's motor. Somatic, that means that it's conscious control. So we're only looking at this part. Now we know that it's conscious control, remember, because it's affecting skeletal muscles. So the function of this division of our nervous system is to allow us to have movement. Like I said, it's voluntary control, so we are aware of what's going on. The only effector involved is skeletal muscle. And because this is conscious control, our cerebrum dictates what movement is occurring. The effect from the somatic division of the nervous system is always stimulatory. It's always a positive effect. Now, if we look at the autonomic division of the nervous system, it's a little bit more complicated. This is involved in homeostasis, so we are not consciously aware of what's going on all the time, and this will affect our internal environments by driving up or down heart rate, blood pressure, pupil diameter, digestion rate, and so on. This type of control is involuntary. We're not aware of what's going on inside, and we don't have any control over it. Our target effector organs will be things like smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, like I've also mentioned, and some glands. Now, what's important to distinguish between the somatic division is that this is not regulated in a large part by the cerebral cortex. It's the medulla oblongata and the hypothalamus. There are some functions which are controlled by the cerebral cortex, but we really want to get across the point that this is involuntary and tends to rely on the the subconscious divisions of our CNS. Okay, so we're going to leave that information there for now. Here are some questions for you to try. These ones are from the 2016 past paper. Please have a go at these questions. That will help you to assess your learning, make sure that you understand what's right and what's wrong. If you have any other questions, then please get in touch.